Hello, and welcome to the launching of the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative Working Group report titled U.S. Leadership Matters in Addressing Forced Displacement Crisis. My name is John Thormajuk, and I am the Director of the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative here at the Wilson Center. I will be the moderator for this event. Thanks to our online audience and in-person audience for tuning in, and thank you for staying with us in the next 90 minutes. We have a great lineup of speakers. To kick off with the opening remarks, I am honored to introduce the Honorable Mark Green, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Wilson Center. Ambassador Green brings more than 3 decades of experience in international development, diplomacy, and public service. Before he joined the Wilson Center in 2021, he was the executive director of the McCain Institute. Prior to that, he has served as the 18th administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, president of the International Republican Institute, president of the Initiative for Global Development, U.S. ambassador to Tanzania, and a 4-term congressman representing Wisconsin 8th District in the House of Representatives for 8 years. What you may not know about him is he volunteered as a high school teacher in Kakamega, Kenya, a country where I lived for almost a decade as a refugee. Ambassador Green has visited refugee camp, displaced camp in Africa, Asia, and beyond. He has a deep personal passion and commitment to the issues we are discussing today. Follow him on his blog, Stubborn Things. Welcome, sir.
Jonathan understands his job well to make me sound better than I really am. I'll take it. Jonathan, thank you, and thanks to all of you for being here, for joining us here at the Wilson Center. As you may know, the Wilson Center is unique in the foreign policy landscape. We are congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. And I always say that I think that congressional charter, it gives us a special status, but also special obligations. And it means we must focus only on the most important, those places where we can make a difference, those challenges that I think are shaping the world today, which is the reason that we're delighted to be hosting the unveiling of this report and today's important discussion. This report by the Wilson Center's Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative, or as we call it, RAFDI, inside the building. This is important to me personally. We established RAFDI not long after I arrived at Wilson. Hopefully the importance and the relevance of the subject is self-evident to all of you. There are displaced people in every region of the world. They're often forcibly displaced by conflicts, persecution, violence, and human rights abuses. And the number of people who have experienced this and been displaced has tripled in the last 30 years. In 1997, there were 33.9 million people displaced. Last September, UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, said that number stood at 110 million. And very sadly, the trends are likely to grow and move faster and faster. We need global cooperation. We need U.S. leadership to address it like never before. RAFDI seeks to expand the space for new perspectives, for constructive dialogue and sustainable solutions that can help inform policies that will lift lives and reinforce opportunities for displaced people. The most important way that RAFDI does its work is through working groups like this working group. We've brought together academics and implementers, experts who have worked their entire careers to address this growing need. And we've asked them to identify and discuss solutions. It is out of their many conversations that this report was crafted. Many of the working group members are here with us today, and you'll have the chance to hear from them firsthand. And I must say that they have my personal gratitude for their involvement and their dedication. This report has been more than 2 years in the making. It provides practical, actionable recommendations on ways to protect, assist, and find sustainable solutions for refugees and other displaced peoples. It calls for sustained leadership to address forced displacement issues, and it identifies 6 major issues that require collective response and leadership. Number 1, prevention and preparedness for forced displacement and its consequences. Second, protection of displaced people while addressing root causes of displacement. 3, solutions for protracted refugees who are stuck in limbo in their host countries. 4, meaningful participation of refugees in decisions and in shaping the narrative. Strengthening international cooperation to protect and assist displaced people. And finally, implementing migrant and refugee compacts and addressing their limitations. Addressing forced displacement requires a reframing of traditional durable solutions. At the end of 2022, there were more than 23 million refugees threatened by 57 protracted crises in 37 host countries. Yet funding and programming continues to reflect the same old approach, which rarely leads to return, local integration, or resettlement. Before I yield my time, I'd like to tell you one quick story. One of the first trips I took as administrator at USAID was to travel to Burma and to Bangladesh. And one of the places I went to was the border crossing closest to Cox's Bazar. And I remember meeting with a young Bangladeshi military officer who told me that right before the wave came in, he had just been posted right there. He had been given no instructions from home, no instructions from the capital. And he said for the first few months, he would hear the occasional noise and maybe the occasional gunshot. And then one day he heard yelling and screaming and sustained fire. And he went out of his post and he looked and he saw a wave of people coming. And he said he had received no instruction. Nobody had prepared him. Nobody told him what to do. And he paused. He said, what am I supposed to do? And he said there were 2 options. Number 1, he could take that rifle and try to hold them back, to fire at them, to stop them. He said, or number 2, he could do the humane thing, which was to welcome them in. He said, in that split second, he knew everything depended upon his decision making. And of course, he stepped aside to let them in. And more than that, working with the people of Bangladesh, they welcomed the Rohingya in. That's the kind of humanity that has to be brought, quite frankly, to the discussions and the debate regarding this global crisis that we all see and we all face. And so that's why I think the work of the working group is so very important. With that, let's get on to the real entertainment here. I have an opportunity to introduce Marta Youth, the PDAS, as we would call it, of the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. For over 25 years, Marta has served as a Foreign Service Officer across Nicaragua, Canada, Ecuador, Spain, India, and even back in the wilds of Washington, D.C. She assumed her current role in 2022 and is tasked with overseeing the Office of International Migration, making her particularly well-versed to speak on the importance of this topic. Marta, we are thrilled and honored to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much. Not a very auspicious beginning. I realized my first page of my remarks I left at the office. Luckily, luckily I have them on my phone here. So thanks so much, Ambassador, and thanks so much to the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative Working Group for inviting the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration to this launch. I just came back yesterday afternoon from the meeting of another working group, the G7 Migration Working Group. We met in Rome to look at many of the self-same issues that were in this report. And the good news is that our partners around the world are focused on focused on forced displacement as we are, and are as eager to work with us and others on durable solutions anchored in protection. So I reread your report on the plane, and I do wish that you had picked a bigger font, because the lighting was really bad. But that aside, I really appreciate the wide-ranging and thoughtful recommendations of the working group. In the few minutes I have to chat with you, I cannot speak to all of the recommendations in depth, but I want to focus on the positive. And thanks to some form of convergent or parallel evolution, I wasn't really focusing in biology, but it's one of those, there's quite a number of actions that the U.S. government has taken that very much align with the RAFDI recommendations. So I'll focus my remarks on the ones that are in the remit of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. The report does a great job laying out the global challenge, and the ambassador just did as well. While the report focuses on forced displacement, refugees, asylum seekers, victims of disaster, flows today are truly mixed. And so additional individuals are also on the move. They may not be forcibly displaced, but they are certainly mixed with others on the move. And that's economic migrants, people seeking family reunification, or simply people seeking a chance at a better life. Given this situation, I increasingly hear the question, how do we stop migration? So I would submit that's the wrong question. People have always migrated, and as long as we have people, we're going to have migration. So the right questions include some of the ones that you all reflected in your report. How do we manage this flow humanely? How do we give people options and solutions? In the context of this report, one of the most significant questions is, how do we tease out the different reasons that people are on the move and figure out what can be done to respond to why they're on the move and give them options? The first option, to really surge development and other programs to give people in countries of origin the option to remain where they are. If they must flee for protection needs, the second option is to build the institutions so that people have the opportunity to seek protection nearby and along the route. We provide humanitarian assistance to help countries around the world strengthen their own asylum systems, support registration and regularization schemes, help develop temporary protection arrangements, and support their integration efforts, as well as programs that benefit generous host communities. We work with organizations like UNHCR and TENT, who help them find jobs and access services in countries of refuge. But then there's the third option. That's the option for people who have to migrate, and to give them the option to migrate safely, to seek protection. So if they're migrating for protection, for opportunity, for family reunification, how do we channel them into lawful pathways so that they can move in a planned, safe, and orderly way, including through expanded refugee resettlement? So my focus, in addition to covering the Office of International Migration, I also oversee the Office of the Western Hemisphere. So this is what I'm most familiar with. But and one of the things that I would say in the Western Hemisphere, there's a lot of this approach. First of all, we've committed to a first ever hemisphere-wide framework, a comprehensive approach that 22 countries of the region have endorsed and enshrined. It's the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. We work with the endorsing countries assiduously to stay on track with ambitious implementation plans focused on stability and integration, legal pathways and protection, and humane border management. And one new innovative way we are approaching the lawful pathways piece is through the Safe Mobility Initiative. These offices, we call them SMOs. We have them in 4 countries in the region, and they're facilitating access to safe and lawful pathways so that refugees and vulnerable migrants don't have to undertake the dangerous journey in search of safety and better opportunities. To date, 174,000 people in the region have submitted applications. More than 30,000 have been referred to UNHCR, and 7,660 have arrived in the United States as refugees. This is a program that we essentially put on paper and thought about 1 year ago, Easter time. I remember because it ruined everyone's Easter holidays. But for us to have this done in so little time and to have it implemented is nothing short of miraculous. And it really, our colleagues at UNHCR and at IOM have been extraordinary. U.S. RAP has traditionally done very little resettlement from Latin America. In fiscal year 2022, it was just over 2,000 individuals. This fiscal year, 2024, we expect to see that number somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000. But this is a global program, and we expect to get as close to the president's target of 125,000 as we can by the end of this fiscal year. We are deeply committed to rebuilding, expanding, and strengthening resettlement as a durable solution. One of the things the report touched on is the United States as a leader, or our leadership on refugee resettlement. We are and will continue to be a global leader on refugee resettlement. And there's one initiative I want to share with you. It's called the Resettlement Diplomacy Network. We lead a wide range of governments from all over the world. There's Australia, the Italians, the Spanish, the UK, and beyond are in it. And the point of this network is to strengthen global resettlement and advance safe, orderly, and humane migration and refugee protection. One of the key things that has come out of it, in addition to a lot of working together on best practices, is the establishment of a red phone, which allows rapid coordination during emergency situations. I also appreciated in the report several mentions of my boss, Assistant Secretary Julieta Noyes, how she ceded the microphone at XCOM to a former refugee. Well, this wasn't an isolated occurrence, but the beginning of the trend. This has happened. She has done this several times, including other refugees on our delegations for various international meetings. Last year, I co-chaired as President Pro Temp the Intergovernmental Consultation on Asylum, Refugees, and Migration, which since it was our turn to be president, we did it here in Washington, and we brought in panels of refugees and migrants to set the scene and share their perspective. We strongly believe their voices, their stories are essential, and they remind us of the human impact of decisions and policies and why it is so important that we find solutions that will save lives and reduce human suffering. Like the ambassador, I'd like to end with a story. Many of you are familiar with Welcome Corps, our flagship private sponsorship program that allows Americans from all walks of life to help welcome refugees into their communities. Well, Julieta, my boss, the assistant secretary, was in Texas earlier this month, and she was meeting with Welcome Corps sponsor circles to hear how they became involved. And she met with one group, and 5 men, 1 woman, and they had joined together. They had they were in an association together in Austin, Texas. And they joined together and pooled their resources and decided that they could sponsor a family of 3. And they specifically asked for a family of Venezuelans who came through one of our SMO offices. And so 2 weeks before Julieta met with them, this family had arrived, a husband, a wife, a child, fleeing persecution in Venezuela. And this group welcomed them. The part that I love about this story is all 5 of the people who formed the sponsor circle were refugees themselves. All had arrived from Congo, some as recently as 2 years ago, some as long as 20 years ago. But they joined together and they said, this is how we pay back this government and this country. And we've learned the lesson of how important it is to welcome people to this country, and now we would like to pay it forward. Just an amazing story, and that is part of why we do this work. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Youth, for the remarks, and again, putting the human face behind the numbers, why we do this. And for our audience, of course, she's a busy person, so when you see her leave, it's because she's going to other stuff. There's a lot going on in the world. So here's the run of the show. In the next few minutes, we have two panels. The first panel will come to the stage, and I will introduce them. And then the second panel will come after them, and then we'll have a conversation. So may I have Sarah Miller, Hal Ferguson, and Laura Robson to come to the stage. And because of time, I will just introduce them very briefly, and then we have the conversation. So the first panel consists of working group members who are also the report contributors, and I will introduce them right now. Next to me is Dr. Sarah Miller, who's a senior fellow at Refugees International, where she covered the Great Lakes and Horn of Africa. She's an adjunct professor at both Fordham University and Georgetown University. Sarah has published many books, articles on forced migration, particularly protracted refugee situation. She is a RAFDI working group member and a contributor to the report. Thanks for joining us. Next is Hal Ferguson, who is the Vice President of Global Operations at the International Republican Institute. Hal has served as a Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary at USAID, where he managed the Middle East Bureau and led efforts to help religious minorities in Iraq and Syria recover from ISIS genocide. He lived in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he was a fellow here, public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, and a current member of the RAFDI working group. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least is Dr. Laura Robson, who is a history professor at Penn State University. As a scholar of international Middle Eastern history, her special interest includes questions of refugeedom, forced migration, and statelessness. She has published extensively on the topic of refugee and minority rights, forced migration, ethnic cleansing, and resettlement. He is also a former fellow here at the Wilson Center and a current member of the RAFDI working group. Thanks for joining us. So let's get started. I will ask this question in the first round for you all to answer. The report here is a culmination of series of meetings over several months, and you have been great contributors to the report. So what is your key highlight? One key highlight that the audience will take away. So let me start with Laura.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jonathan, so much. This has been a really tremendously rewarding experience, I think, to work on this report and to work on this project with all of these wonderful colleagues, and to think really seriously about what the practical as well as kind of philosophical possibilities are for thinking in a more equitable way about questions of refugee rights across the globe. So I really have appreciated the chance to talk with everyone and come to the conclusions collectively that we have in this report. So for me, the key takeaway from our work and from this report as it stands is that refugee policy is inextricably entangled with broader questions concerning migration and asylum and border protection policies in ways that have often come to seem a problem, but that I think we collectively have decided to regard as an opportunity. And what I mean by that is that improvements in refugee protection and refugee policy also will represent improvements in other difficult areas of political decision-making and have the tendency to make all of these interconnected systems more coherent and more efficient and more protective. So I'll just give a couple of very quick examples of what I mean by this. And one of the things that I want to point out is that the report suggests, as one of its proposals, to offer greater protection to refugees, it would be useful to make what it calls a more permanent change to how the U.S. accepts migrant workers who may otherwise seek irregular pathways. So on the face of it, this is an example of the kind of interconnection of these systems, because on the face of it, this does not, strictly speaking, seem to be a refugee issue. But it is absolutely crucial for making the path to asylum clearer and faster and fairer by reducing the numbers and the backlog of processing claims at the southern border, but also kind of in other spheres, not least to protect the interests and the well-being of refugees. So this is one of the ways in which this report is suggesting a kind of integrated approach that moves beyond protecting refugees towards making improvements in a more general system, the more general system of migration. We have a couple of other examples as well. The report's recommendation for utilizing the provisions in the Refugee Act to increase both the ceiling for admissions in response to emergencies and things like the use of in-country processing to resolve temporary statuses in refugee claims. These are connected to broader questions about streamlining and expanding the process of admissions of migrants more generally. We need to understand how these are connected and how comparatively straightforward, I recognize it's not absolutely straightforward, but relatively straightforward, reforms to refugee systems, often that, as the report points out, build on already extant legal practices and frameworks, can actually help with migration as an issue in its entirety. The same is true of the report's recommendation to provide greater support, for instance, to border communities who are bearing the brunt of receiving large numbers of these kind of mixed flows of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers all at once. And finally, on this point of refugee protection, I want to emphasize our report's suggestions about regularizing the many types of temporary status that are offered to different kinds of refugees, and rather focusing on creating clear paths to some kind of permanent status. In general, it would be beneficial to these systems as a whole to move away from this concept that we have of offering temporary relief, which is a very prominent aspect of our current system, for instance, TPS or humanitarian parole, and to instead think in terms of clearer and simpler and more reliable paths to long-term residency and regularized status, which, as the report points out, is usually the practical outcome in any case. Finally, Jonathan asked me to speak very briefly to the question of forcible return. And I think that we need to acknowledge here that the international community, and particularly the UNHCR's longstanding commitment to the idea of repatriation as the preferred, quote-unquote, durable solution, has proven to be problematic in certain respects and has too often served to entrench and even worsen problems of displacement that it hoped to solve. So it may well be that as we consider the possibilities for policy looking into the future, the U.S. might begin to think about de-emphasizing return without necessarily abandoning it altogether in favor of other sorts of responses to forced displacement, including, and I hope we've pointed out some possible ways to do this, an increased willingness to consider and fund and facilitate resettlement, particularly in the countries of the global north that have a greater capacity for absorption of refugees, as well as other kinds of migrants and displaced people. So I'll close my comments there, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Laura. And Hal, the same question. What is your key highlight from the report?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And I do want to take the opportunity to thank you again for your leadership in this. As Jonathan mentioned, I was a fellow at the Wilson Center and was involved in some of the early development of the RAFDI initiative and helped Jonathan get the initial grant. And then I left and took my current job and left Jonathan with all the work. So thank you, Jonathan, for allowing me to stay engaged and involved. It's something that the question of forced displacement is something that I worked on peripherally while I was at USAID, but certainly while I was at the Wilson Center, something that I became very acutely focused on. Let me focus on just a couple of aspects of prevention, as was sort of laid out in this report. Mindful of time, I'll touch on two things. First, I want to speak to kind of the budgetary reality, if I might, which sounds a little, sort of, unsexy. But the budgetary reality, I think, is important for us to grapple with, because it's practical, it's tangible, it's in front of us. Over the last, since the 1980s, U.S. foreign assistance has declined measurably as a percentage of GDP, right? So the pie has been shrinking in terms of our foreign aid in the world. On top of that, just in the last 10 years, the accounts of foreign assistance as administered by USAID and State Department predominantly that are focused on economic development, democracy, human rights and governance, et cetera, have also declined within that shrinking pie. Democracy, human rights, and governance, for example, has shrunk by half from 2011 to 2021. At the same time, the money that's been devoted to humanitarian assistance has tripled from 2011 to 2021, and dwarfs the amount in 2021 that was devoted to economic development, for example. Now, this obviously is reflective of the considerable increase in forced displacement over the same period of time, right? You heard Ambassador Green say that the forced displacement has tripled over the last 3 decades. Well, it's doubled since 2011, since the last 10 years or so. So it's a huge problem that we're devoting more and more resources to. And I will also say, on the topic of financial resources, this is almost exclusively a Western financial burden. We like to think of UNHCR and the UN as a global compact to collectively face global problems, but really the financial burden inevitably falls on the U.S. and its allies, predominantly the U.S. foremost among them. One example, in 2023, the U.S. gave $1.9 billion to UNHCR. During the same year, China, second largest economy in the world, provided UNHCR with $2 million. So this is a burden, an increasing burden that the United States and our allies face. So within that budgetary reality, what I would propose is, while not de-emphasizing the real need of refugees, IDPs, other forced displacement, we do need to really refocus on the durable solutions, the root causes, the solutions within broken countries and difficult environments, to try and pull those places into a more stable and sustainable trajectory and course. In other words, humanitarian assistance, and I think the humanitarians would agree with this, it's intended to be a short-term solution, right? We're taking care of people who need help right now, today, and tomorrow. We cannot lose sight of the fact that if we're going to actually reach a sustainable solution, that we need to work to build those economies, to put in place accountable systems of governance that will not generate new refugees in the first place. So the budgetary reality and a focus on root causes would be the first point that I would make. Secondly, and lastly, this is a little bit more tangible, but I think it's an interesting point that the report makes, which frankly I hadn't really considered until we were developing this. If you look at the top 4 countries that are producing the most refugees in recent years, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Venezuela. Well, 3 of those 4 are the target of ruinous United States sanctions, right? For good reason. Afghanistan, Venezuela, and Syria are not friends to the United States, and the regimes there are reprehensible. And yet, the sanctions that we've put in place have exacerbated the mismanagement of those economies by those governments and contributed to forced displacement or large numbers of people leaving those countries. Venezuela is perhaps a really great example insofar as we put in place sanctions to punish the Maduro regime after a stolen election that cut off access to financial instruments for their oil and the gas sector, which is the predominance of their economy. And so their economy collapsed, and millions of Venezuelans have left. Now, I would argue that the Maduro regime doesn't really care too much. The competitors the United States faces today on the global stage are perfectly willing to weaponize their own populations, right, or the populations of neighboring states, while recognizing we'll be the ones to shoulder the financial burden of caring for these displaced people. And yet, at the same time, our economic sanctions are not doing much to, frankly, dislocate these regimes that we're trying to combat in the first place. So to me, this is just another example of how economic sanctions are not a great instrument to affect change in countries with whom we have real problems. And we need to start thinking about refugee displacement much more centrally in our foreign policy discussions when we consider ways to push back against competitors that we're facing in the world today. With that, I'll stop. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Hal. And Sarah, in addition to answering the question about the highlight, maybe this is also gateway to the second round. We do have protracted refugees, more than 23 million as of recent data. And these refugees are locked in and locked out. They cannot return home because it's not safe yet. They are not integrated into the host countries because the host country policies don't allow them to. And then they cannot get the chance for resettlement because that is reserved for a very few number. And then they don't have opportunities for their livelihoods. So they are stuck in limbo. How do we go beyond the three durable solutions? Since they seem not to be working for the protracted refugees.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think when many of us get consumed into the headlines of the latest crises, it's very easy to forget that the majority of displacement situations, including refugees and others, are indeed protracted. And I think many of us in this space continue to wrestle with that. And you've highlighted this, the report does, and most of us have said, we recognize that the system is not keeping up with the pace of need, right? And the solutions, return, local integration, resettlement, that we're constantly teaching our students about and all those we work with, are generally not working for the vast majority. Now, that sounds very grim, and it's very upsetting, and we might all feel like we're ready to just go home and give up. But I think there are some really positive places where we're seeing progress, creative thinking, and moving forward. And I know some of the people in this room could probably speak even more to this. And I think these are places where the U.S. can take leadership and emphasize. So the first would be on participation and meaningful engagement with displaced populations. Now, that's a whole nother section of the report, so I'm not here to cover every single dimension, but it relates so inherently to protracted displacement. There is an entire resource of individuals who are well-equipped and better placed to conceptualize what solutions best fit their displacement than Sarah sitting in Chicago, right? There are people who have skills, capacities, have a clear understanding. And so I think step one is listening to and putting in the driver's seat displaced populations themselves if we're trying to talk about solutions to protracted displacement. And so I hope you'll see some of the linkages between different parts in the report, that the participation and meaningful engagement is directly related to how we think about protracted displacement and how we consider our engagement from, here sitting in Washington, D.C., from large international organizations, all the way to the level of a camp in, whether we're talking Kakuma or Cox's Bazar. So there's a lot of opportunity there that we're missing out on, and that hopefully in additional comments we can talk about giving people access to the labor market. Livelihood opportunities and self-reliance. Those are places where we can do so much more, and we don't have to sit in kind of the doom and gloom of, oh my gosh, these situations are intractable. We are without solutions. The system is failing itself. I think the U.S., and I think a key takeaway here is that the U.S. can offer a lot of leadership here. It is true that we are continuing to see rising numbers. We are seeing protracted conflicts, which means protracted displacement. That is all very true. But the U.S. has an opportunity to to really lead and emphasize in some of these areas, including meaningful engagement and participation, which is going to help lead to new and creative solutions and other types of conceptualizing what does it mean to no longer be displaced. It's not as clean and tidy as we often see in our textbooks in thinking about the Refugee Convention or other groups of displaced. So that's a great starting point. But then also tapping into some of those skills and giving people access to work and support themselves so we don't see instances where people are reliant on aid for years and years and years on end, which nobody wants, not least the people who are receiving that aid, and certainly not those who are funding it as well, and organizations who are certainly keen to move to other areas. So I think the U.S. can lead by pressing those issues, by funding those initiatives, by pushing those types of approaches. They perhaps might not grab the headlines, but I think they've proven to have a lot of impact to working in a different way with the displaced population, and then pushing some of those opportunities. The last thing I would say, and I just finished one of the classes I was teaching with Georgetown students yesterday, and we always finish with, is the system fit for purpose, and is it capable of evolving? And we start the semester thinking about the humanitarian principles and the types of engagement we see in the global refugee regime. And we think about, okay, is the type of engagement starting from a place of duty or charity? And I think in the U.S. context, and this report I think gives some of this, we hear a little bit about kind of the charitable, okay, it's great the U.S. is trying to support and help, but there's also a sense of duty. And I think you've kind of touched on that a little bit in some of your remarks as well, Hal, that there's a duty in terms of the U.S. involvement, footprint, engagement as a leader on the financing side. There's a lot of places where I think the U.S. has a responsibility to continue to uphold the global refugee regime, to continue to emphasize the rights and protections that we see laid out that are constantly under threat by states that don't want to meet those responsibilities. And so I think my key takeaway from the report would be that there is an opportunity for leadership here. Sometimes there's a dollar sign attached to that, but there are also many other things that I think the U.S. can do to continue to uphold these principles that we've laid out. So that would be my key takeaway. Thanks.
Thank you. And for our online audience, if you want to submit question for the first panel, start doing so. We'll take a few questions before we move to the next panel. Laura, I'm going to go back to you on what Sarah just touched, upholding the global refugee regime, because that is the basis of refugee protection. What we have seen, and the report point out some of it, that the protection space is shrinking, not from non-signatories of the Geneva Convention, but mostly from those who have signed it. And as the report argued about, leading by example, if those who have signed the Geneva Convention don't uphold it, then what about those who have not signed? And those who have not signed actually have paradoxically taken leadership in some of this. Although in recent years, of course, in recent months, Pakistan has forcibly returned Afghanistan refugees. So what should we do in this situation where the protection space is shrinking? And what is in layman's language is protection? Because it can mean different things. So in 1 minute,
So these are really central questions, and I want to make a couple of points in response that won't really answer them in their entirety. But one is that, which also speaks to some of the points that Hal was making, which is about the role of countries of the global north and the countries of the global south in upholding the refugee regime, the international refugee regime that we have, and in this question of refugee protection. Something like currently, we have a situation where, as Hal pointed out, the vast majority of money coming into international institutions that support refugee work comes from the global north. However, a vast majority of refugees are hosted in the global south, something like 85%, right? So, and in fact, one of the situations that we have with respect to the convention itself is that there are many more refugees hosted in non-signatory countries than in signatory countries, right? So we have to think about, what do these promises of refugee rights mean when they are largely signed onto by countries that have been broadly unwilling to open their own doors to resettle refugees? I think this is a real and central question in thinking about what protection could look like, right? Because I think there are some ways in which wealthy countries have allowed money that goes into these major institutions to replace the kind of individual country level responsibility that they might otherwise feel to take people in. So I think that that is a question that we really have to face when we think about what protection means, what signing on to these conventions means. And I think that I would suggest that the actual the act of signing on to a convention that offers these kinds of protections is less meaningful when it is undertaken by countries who are actually not willing to extend those protections to very many people in practical terms. So I think that we do need to think about what this role of resettlement is in protection regimes, and what kinds of expectations the United States and other wealthy countries can have of countries that are, in fact, shouldering most of the practical burden of welcoming refugees into their spaces.
Thank you. And Hal, you touched this early on, but I want to follow up on, when we talk of root causes, we talk about the policy implication of our policies. Policy that would lead, and you touch the economic sanctions. One of the report's recommendations would be to prioritize the impact assessment policy. We do environmental impact assessment, other policy. Why not the displacement impact assessment? And in the case of U.S., prioritize in the national security agenda. Make a comment on that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jonathan. Forced displacement features in the national security agenda primarily in a reactive way, right? Like, oh, there's millions of refugees pouring across this border. What do we do about it? Let's get enhanced assistance to these folks and do what we can to help them. It's very rarely some sort of a proactive part of the agenda. And as I was saying before, I mean, I think it's long overdue that we actually consider the impact of our actions from a foreign policy perspective on forced displacement or simple migration, put it that way, right? Because we do need to recognize that we are contributing to displacements through economic sanctions or historically military action, et cetera. And we need to recognize that, and we need to, as you say, assess that as part of the factors that go into determining what our response to a challenge is going to be. And I do think, I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but I think we all recognize that there is an instinct in Washington to default to more and more economic sanctions because it's easy, makes us feel good, makes us feel like we're doing something good. But actually, there's some pretty considerable downsides to economic sanctions, and there's little to no evidence that they actually mount to any useful outcome in terms of affecting the behavior of regimes. Thanks.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge the presence of maybe members of the foreign embassies here, other dignitaries, and online. After Sarah, we're going to have questions from the audience or online, so get ready. Sarah, there is an opening, an opportunity, as you mentioned, in the discussion about protracted displacement and the role of the World Bank and others in coming in. World Bank is not traditionally part of the humanitarian landscape. But maybe comment briefly about the role they are playing in terms of availing opportunities for protracted
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think one of the biggest trends in recent years that many of us in this refugee humanitarian space are trying to learn more about and work on, simply because the World Bank offers an entirely new, different approach to responding to displacement. Now, it's not a panacea. We're not finding, magic answers, but the role of the World Bank and other financing actors is changing the landscape considerably, right? So it's coming in with a different type of approach than the traditional humanitarian emergency response. That's different types of projects, different types of funding cycles, working with governments in different ways than traditional humanitarian approaches have been. And that, of course, leads to new opportunities. Now, there are hazards and concerns that come with that as well, but that's a considerable amount of additional funding. And so I think there is a potential opportunity here where we see financing institutions like the World Bank, we see other development actors engaging in forced displacement and refugee situations in new and important ways. And that's central to a lot of our research with self-reliance or the Labor Market Access Project. I have colleagues here who could speak about this all day. But it really is a potential game changer. So if you are looking for where we see new opportunities, it is considering how those types of actors are changing things. Now, those who are centralized on protection need to continue to protect the origins of the refugee system and uphold asylum. But some of these new actors absolutely can be game changers, which is really critical. And I think the U.S. should encourage that.
Thank you. Now is the time for the audience to speak a little bit. So what I would ask is just state your name, your affiliation, one question. Just question, not speech, please. So that we have the second panel with exciting perspective coming up. So, hands up. Right. 1, 2. So 2 at a time. So start.
Thank you so much, and fascinating topic and great panel. My name is Lis Cord. Until February of this year, I was the Global Director for Social Inclusion and Sustainability at the World Bank. So our teams were very actively involved in projects in Colombia, Horn of Africa, West Africa, and I won't go into saying anything about that and giving more detail on the approach. But it's a question that I have for the panel that comes from the work that we've done, which is many of you have alluded, you've talked also, Sarah and others, about some of the labor market impacts that are, but why do we not try to sell more firmly the economic contributions that migrants can make? I mean, the biggest challenge we face in the US at least is, and often in many of our recipient countries for refugees, is the political challenges. And if we could highlight the enormous economic contributions and collect the data, there are new ways to collect household survey data on targeted groups. And yet, the report doesn't highlight this. You kind of touch on it, but you don't mention it as a major driver for policy change. And I was curious why. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and I should say I also represent now here in the capacity of Tostan International, an NGO in West Africa that works on community development.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. Cindy.
Great. Thank you so much for this discussion. I'm Cindy Arnson. I'm a distinguished fellow here at the Wilson Center. And my question is very much along the lines of Louise's. How do you take these, what seem to me eminently sensible, not only humanitarian, but practical suggestions, and translate them into the current political environment in which we live in the United States, which is not that different from our allies in Western Europe that are also, the destination for many refugees and migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. In other words, you're entering a political context that is so volatile and so hostile to migrants and refugees. Can you envision ways of framing this discussion in a way that allows for constructive entry into the political process and dynamics that advanced industrial countries are facing? Thanks.
All right, thank you. Is there an online question? Yes. One more, then the panel will answer.
From Roy Gutman, president of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. Syria is one of the biggest contributors to the number of forcibly displaced. What are the lessons to draw from the U.S. and international community's handling of the Syria crisis? There, the displacement seems to be deliberate. What are the lessons for policy and humanitarian aid?
Okay. All right. All right, team, 3 questions. Pick what you want to pick. Economic contribution of migrant, why not highlighting it? We are in a volatile political situation. How do you translate all this into practical? And then the Syria situation, what lesson can the international community learn? So, start.
Great.
Sarah.
Well, you teed up nicely some of the conversation about our labor market access project that Refugees International does with the Center for Global Development, and that was the subject of a lot of this report as we talked about, as you said, the economic contributions that refugees and other displaced people can make. You know, a lot of times I think it's framed as, you know, you're sort of doing a favor to displaced people to let them work. But the reality is, it's a fantastic opportunity. Refugees and IDPs and other forced migrants come with skills and experiences ready to contribute to the local labor markets and their host communities that can be a benefit both to the local community. And I'm sure the World Bank has given thought to this, of course. In a lot of our studies, we've discussed this. And so it absolutely is an opportunity and is absolutely something we can and all should be emphasizing more, that it's not necessarily a charitable act, but there's genuine economic benefit here to having refugees access the labor market. And this speaks directly to protracted displacement as well, because if we're talking about these types of situations where conflicts are continuing, right? We know that people are not going to be able to return home. We know we're not seeing other solutions. If people can begin to support themselves and contribute to the local economy, it's a no-brainer. We have seen some opportunities. So Kenya is, of course, a big discussion. We've done case studies on Colombia and Ethiopia. And of course, there are still many barriers, but absolutely, I'm so glad you're highlighting that message again, and I think continuing to find ways to work on this in a deeper capacity is absolutely the way to go, and a way to kind of continue to build out these seemingly intractable, protracted situations. So I agree.
Hal, I assume you would take the Syrian question.
Oh, great.
That's,
Great.
I was going to
that's
assign
right.
it to you.
Well, all right. Let me just say one thing, just to piggyback off of what Sarah was saying, and then I'll get to the Syria question. I mean, one of the presentations actually that Laura first gave, you know, over a year ago at this point as part of this discussion, really struck a chord with me insofar as, you know, in as recently as the 19th century, like population was seen as an unalloyed good for an empire. You know, you went out and you got some more population by invasion or by colonialism or whatever. You got some population and then you put them to work, you know, and that made your empire stronger. And with the emergence of nationalism in the nation states and just, I mean, again, not to speak for Laura, who is a scholar on this, you know, we got to a place today where that is no longer the case. Population, a whole bunch of people showing up in your country is actually a liability, right? And that's sort of a fundamental change of the equation here. And so trying to like rebalance that is a very interesting thing in which you actually change the frame and say, no, these people are contributing to the economy. It is good. There are very deep-seated cultural, I think, elements here that are not just unique to the United States, but look around anywhere where you have large refugee populations, and there's a lot of reluctance everywhere to truly integrate these folks. Okay, Syria. Yeah, this is a tough one, but I actually think it's an important one to stare in the face, right? So Syria is one of the countries I highlighted where the United States has like very severe economic sanctions in place, and yet it was not the sanctions that caused mass displacement in Syria, right? It was the essentially ethnic cleansing on the part of the Assad regime, who was only too happy to push out millions of Sunni Arabs as part of the civil war there, right? And so that's an example of where Assad was happy to weaponize his own population and indeed sort of push out large numbers of his own population. He didn't care. It was good for him. And place that burden on the United States, our allies, other proximate countries. And frankly, the only solution to that would have been a much more concerted, much more direct, much more aggressive resolution to the conflict, right? Let's just put it that way. And this went on for several years in which the U.S. and our allies sort of weren't quite sure how involved we should be in this conflict. And, well, we don't want to get ourselves stuck in another Middle East war, et cetera, et cetera. And we sort of kind of did, but only a little bit. I mean, look, if we really wanted to do something about the mass displacement out of Syria that was causing like pretty severe dislocation and instability in Europe, well, we would have had to have gotten much more aggressive about resolving that conflict, right? Which is to say, we need to get pretty serious about the Assad regime. Because at this point today, it's just another frozen conflict. It's a frozen conflict to add to so many other frozen conflicts around the world where we're sort of like keeping a lid on it, but haven't fixed it. There's still millions of Syrian refugees living in Turkey with no sort of future, obviously, to them in terms of resettlement or resolution. They're not going back to Syria anytime soon. And so that's not an easy answer, I think, to the question that was asked. But I think it's certainly a warning case of where a conflict can just produce a lot of secondary destabilizing effects if we let it just sort of putter on by itself without us exerting our influence and power as we can.
Thank you, and thank you again for staying with us. We will have the second panel in about a minute, but I would like Laura to comment on the other two and add to the question of translating this and the volatility of the political situation.
Yeah, thank you. So I have two things to say that I think come together, and these two questions sort of meet in the middle in some respects. Thank you for the shout out, Tal. I appreciate it. So I do want to speak to this question of labor as a good, as an economic good. It is true, certainly historically, prior to the kind of current refugee regime that we have that began in the early 1950s, international institutions like the League of Nations organized their refugee policy around the idea of employment and around the idea that refugees could be put to work in various capacities around the globe. And I want to add also that this is a classical reading of capitalist philosophy as well, that there should be not just free movement of goods, but also free movement of people, right? And that one of the bargains that was kind of struck in the making of the current nation-state-centered order was that only half of that equation would be realized, for that there would be a kind of, press in restricted but nevertheless important ways for free markets in goods, but not free migration of people. And so I do think that there is a conversation to be had in the political sphere around the kind of originary concepts of what a free market would look like and what the implications would be for the movement of people and the economic benefits that adhered to states and political entities that encouraged migration, that we have a long history of that, that could be instructive and a part of the conversation in ways that it hasn't been. And the other thing that I want to point out about the economics, the kind of political economy of migration, is that the sorts of massive efforts that we put into rejecting migrants and refugees at borders is also very expensive, right? There are a lot of resources that go into the making of militarized borders, of the externalization of borders, the kinds of restraints and restrictions and deportations and, removals. These policies also cost states money. And that is something that I think very rarely comes up in conversations, right? When we're talking about resources, how much are we spending on this versus bringing people in ways that would be essentially, assisting them, but also assisting us, right? Building up economies, building up labor markets, building up, the relationship between migrants and citizens in productive ways. So I think that's a political point that is too rarely made, and that it's something that we should bring into the conversation to a much greater extent.
Well, thank you very much. The first panel, again, the report is available online, but please join me in thanking the first panel. All right. Now the second, and they will be seated here, so you have more questions later, you can converse with them. But now I welcome the second panel to the stage. We have great speakers coming again, Lauren Post-Thomas, Matthew Reynolds, and Nili Yosinga to the stage. Okay. I will now introduce quickly the second panel, which will focus on reflection but practicality of the report recommendation, but also it's from the perspective of institutions. So they can comment on what has already been said and what they. So next to me is Lauren Post-Thomas, who is a senior advocacy officer for Refugee and Safe Water Initiative at the Hilton Foundation. The foundation is a big partner and funding partner here with RAFDI. So we are glad to have her here. And what her initiative works on is to improve the lives of children and families affected by forced displacement. Previously, she served as senior advisor to the assistant administrator for USAID Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, where she works on humanitarian policy. Thanks for joining us, Lauren. Next is Matthew Reynolds, with the regional representative of the U.S. And the Caribbean at the UNHCR, the Refugee Agency. He is spent 17 years in Congress and working also at the State Department as the Assistant Secretary of State for the Legislative Affairs Bureau, where he was also the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary. Matt is also a member of the working group, but he's going to bring the perspective of institution. Thanks, Matt, for joining us. And Nelly Yosinga is the Executive Director of Refugee Congress, the only national advocacy organization that is built and led by former or current refugees and asylees. Previously, she was a research project manager at the Institute for the Study of International Migration and Senior Vice President for Research at Georgetown University. She currently serves as advisor for Concordia. Thank you, team. And now I will begin. What is your reflection on the report? And I think if we keep the first round just to 1 minute, and then you will go in depth when I add the second question. So let's start with you, Matt.
Great, thank you, and I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and to my colleagues on the panel, as well as those that were part of the report production, and to you, Jonathan, for all of the support that you've provided and for inviting us, and including UNHCR in this important project. Sort of as I think for me, the takeaway, and a lot was explained in panel one, is the reminder really to everyone, the reminder that forced displacement continues to grow exponentially with a wide range of far-reaching impacts, internal and external, national security, economic, social. It's no longer, as we know, just about one or two crises. And I'll tell you, I got my start in this business with the Cambodia genocide. So, there were only a few big issues. And today we have 40, 50, 60 major emergencies. To remind people, as has been noted, the old crises persist. 45 years for Afghanistan. The Palestinians is 76 years. We have new crises, Sudan, Ukraine. We have rekindled crises such as Bangladesh and Ethiopia, and little, if any, solutions. Natural disasters, disasters get resolved pretty quickly and successfully here. It just it also reinforces through the recommendations that practical, effective responses exist, especially if pursued with effective U.S. leadership. And this is particularly useful for us with UNHCR to have a valued third-party expert, the Wilson Center, and the report, a validation of the situation and a validation of the solutions, because there's either a lot of anti or diminished UN support, despite facts and solutions, and it's easy to politicize forced displacement. I mean, look at today how many Lebanese political interests are targeting Syrians to cover up their own corruption and incompetence. So it's good to have this non-partisan, non-political resource reference for others to validate the things we're trying to do. So thank you.
Thank you. And Neely, what's your reflection from institutional perspective?
I'll try to keep it to one and only to 60 seconds. But I think there was a lot to reflect on in this report because it really highlights both where we are and where we're headed. But it was also just a reinforcement of how critical U.S. leadership is. And that could be leading best practices, that could be leading harmful policies. So I think do the former and do it well. But I think the other thing it reinforced, looking at some of the recommendations, was really validating the policy and advocacy priorities that a lot of refugees in the U.S. already have. So looking at protracted crises, which was really, really great to see that that had continued to come up. It's something that we are aggressively pushing for. It is something that all of the refugee communities in the U.S. are asking for. There is not enough attention being paid to some of those critical crises. Looking at family reunification and pathways, that's something else that, you know, came up and was reflected and really does validate what refugee communities want, and things even just like reforming temporary protected status and recognizing that these are people who are not going home, and so we have to figure out a pathway for them. And I think the other thing I mention is I think it's really interesting to look at the recommendation on meaningful refugee participation as it relates to even some of the legislation that was mentioned in this report. And it's worth noting how deeply refugees were involved in the Afghan Adjustment Act or in reiterations of the Refugee Protection Act and the idea of a resettlement floor. And there's also another piece of legislation, the Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act. I mean, these are all things that refugee communities directly engaged in. And I think the last thing I'll say is that this conversation is very different from one that we were having 5 years ago about refugee participation. And these recommendations in the report are substantive ways to continue an engagement that has already started, rather than one that's just about conscience and having refugees in the room.
Thank you. Lauren, the same question, your key reflection, but also I will ask you to start the second round with the question of the philanthropic perspective on these issues in terms of meaningful participation of refugees, in terms of global cooperation and the institution that protect refugees. So start with your reflection and then delve into the second question.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to RAFDI, the Wilson Center. This is really impressive work, and the Hilton Foundation is feel incredibly privileged and fortunate to be able to support your work and hopefully continue to support it long after this report. I think the report to me is a really excellent state of play of where we are right now. We've had some really interesting progress, and I'd say the last 5-10 years, as Nili mentioned, as Sarah mentioned in the first panel. And two of those areas that are most relevant for us at the Hilton Foundation that I just want to highlight are one around meaningful refugee participation. This has taken a leap in progress since, certainly 5 years ago, even in the last 2 years. And it's really been incredible to see that and to be a part of that and supporting that effort. And I think we're hearing more and more from states, from UN agencies. We do want to listen to the populations that are affected by these conflicts and these crises and by displacement. And that is not something that I think we really heard much of just a couple years ago. The other piece of this that I think is important, and Sarah, you started talking about this a bit at the end of the last panel, is the injection of funding from multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the IDB. This has been in my view, pretty game-changing in the way that we're responding to refugee crises. We're introducing development solutions where they're needed because a protracted displacement crisis is not really a humanitarian one any longer. We need different tools, we need different financing structures, different policies to make that happen. And what the banks have been able to do is leverage their financing for policy reform. And that's something really different than a lot of the other actors in the system can do. And I think that that's been an incredible improvement in just the last couple of years since the bank really took this on as a big priority. But of course, I think the report also highlights that not enough has been done. Some of these recommendations have been in the ether for a while, and we haven't seen significant movement against them. I mean, a floor for admissions, like how long have we been talking about that, right? And so, I think when we it's, I mean, amazing to have this report out there. And I am eager to figure out, okay, how do we make some of these recommendations reality, especially the ones that have been around, and that we have an evidence base for, we have strong advocacy for. What's it going to take to convince U.S. leadership or the UN system to really move in a direction more quickly? So those are my reflections on the report, Jonathan. In terms of philanthropy's role in this, I think there's generally two ways that philanthropy and institutions like the Hilton Foundation can play. One is our funding, and the other is advocacy. So I'll talk a little bit about both. On the funding side, I think in addition to access, like funding is often a major barrier for refugee leaders to be able to participate in policymaking and decision making at a national level, at a global level, or maybe even at a district level. And organizations like ours, we can be more nimble than your traditional bilateral or multilateral donor. We can provide multi-year financing directly to refugee-led and migrant-led organizations or other local partners. And we can fund things like administrative staff. We can fund HR functions. We can fund back office functions. We can fund M&E. And these are things that you don't always see supported amongst the refugee-led organizations when they're even able to access funding from major donors in the system. And I think we're really demonstrating this can be done. It is not that difficult. The partners exist. They're well capacitated. You'll see that a lot of them have been around for a very long time, working as subgrantees to INGOs, and can stand on their own if we just give them the right funding for that. And then the second piece of this for philanthropy, look, I mean, we're a private donor. I can say what I want on this stage with few repercussions, and often refugee leaders or people who have been displaced, there are repercussions if they speak out, and that may be the case within their country, or if they want to say something critical of, say, UNHCR, it could impact their funding landscape in future years, right? Or in the current year. And so I think a role that we can play at the foundation is to say the hard truths, and raise up and lift up some of the voices and arguments that we've heard for a really long time from refugee colleagues, and help them gain access in these spaces, but also echo them and stand either in front of them or behind them, however makes sense for their situation. And then just to tie this a little bit back to the funding piece, of course there are many, many refugee-led organizations that can speak, will speak, really want to be on that global stage, and we can fund that kind of advocacy too. And there are a number of organizations like the ones that Nili runs and others like our seat that are doing incredible work around creating more systematic ways for refugees to engage in global conversations through advisory boards, through creating ways for refugees to sit on delegations, as Das Youth raised. And we're able to fund that kind of activity through our work. I think the systematic piece is really important. We need to create a way for this not just to be a blip, right? Like we've seen so much progress in the last couple of years, and the participation piece is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. There's many refugees who have very specific experience, expertise, people like John Thun, who have much more to say on an international stage than the Hilton Foundation or I personally can. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lauren. And now let's go to you, Nili, and then we'll end with Matt. One of the positive trends that in the report is that the meaningful participation of refugees is not like, as you mentioned earlier, it used to be when the advocacy was give them the chance. The chance that has been given in two global refugee forums. The first one was 75 refugees, and the last one was more than 300. So the recommendation is to sustain and increase that, because there is a case to be made about their meaningful participation. And leading by example is using the model that has been used before and be replicated elsewhere. And so Refugee Congress and the advisory board, PRM involvement, we are talking about the reality of implementing this. So tell us something about Refugee Congress doing the implementation, or what is the challenge?
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I really want to start off by noting that the work that we have done here in the U.S. on meaningful refugee participation just would not have been possible without funders like the Hilton Foundation and Open Society Foundation. It would not have been possible without some of UNHCR's initiatives like the Lived Experience Advisory Board, Refugee Advisory Group. It wouldn't have been possible without our seat, as Lauren mentioned, and it wouldn't have been possible without a receptive audience at PRM. But those things did not happen overnight. It took a long time to get there, and I think that would probably be our biggest piece of advice: is not to move so fast. These kinds of changes happen in increments. Refugee Congress is led all by forcibly displaced people, and we use that term intentionally because our members don't come through one pathway. It's meant to signify that people have come through a number of different pathways to get here. They're all volunteers, and that allows us to have perspectives not just from leaders who have organizing and advocacy experience, or to whom we could provide some of that training, but also they represent every sector of our workforce. So if you're having a conversation about medical licensing reform, we have leaders who can speak to that from a personal experience and a professional experience in terms of what that means. The gap in our work really had to do with not having a sustained mechanism for engagement on global refugee policies. So how can US-based refugee leaders have an impact there? And so that's where we started thinking about a refugee advisory board that would do explicitly that. But it was an iterative process working with PRM to get guidance on, first of all, understanding what's possible and what's not possible, just the realities of working with the US government, understanding what some of those limitations are. They were incredibly helpful in giving us advice and also encouragement. And that was really critical to the build. And I think the other thing that was critical was just that we were able to create it sustainably. And it took 8 months to build our bylaws and build a governing structure that will transcend year to year, that will transcend past the terms of the advisors themselves. I think the fact that we were able to build, accountability mechanisms to the communities that the board serves was pretty critical. And just the fact that it was built with an explicit purpose of having professional expertise in addition to lived expertise. And that was something else that the U.S. government had indicated would be really, really important to have. That lived experience is critical. There's a time and a place for those feedback loops from community members. But there's also a piece there that's just, it would be really helpful to have people who are experts on complementary pathways or refugee resettlement. So, those are some of the pieces of how we did it. And I have thoughts on how to keep that engagement going, but I'll leave that for now.
Okay, thank you very much. And Matt, the international refugee system, the global humanitarian system, is based on global cooperation. And there seems to be an issue now, as indicated by the under-resourced, under-funding of most of the programs that you work on. I wonder if you could comment on strengthening that. One of the report recommendations is to adequate funding so that UNHCR and other agencies can carry out their work. But it looks like there is still a challenge. And then one other thing is the strict that the report recommends is the strict accountability measures for this institution that protect refugees to make sure that. So, your comments.
Yes, thanks. Our needs that we assess every year across the globe of what is needed is close to $11 billion. What we receive in help is somewhere between 5 and 6. So that tells you right away that there is a major underfunding of this humanitarian response. And it's not so much that countries have not been generous, it's that the exponential growth of forced displacement is outstripping the income, if you will. Expenditure is outstripping income in those lights. One of the important parts of the report is talking about leadership and American leadership, which has been traditional in this and its impact. So I think it's fair to say the world does look at the United States leadership on these issues, despite various ebbs and flows in how the U.S. actually exercises that leadership. So what I'd like to do is just briefly comment on to show how American leadership impacts this situation, impacts of helping forcibly displaced within the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency context. So a leading strong United States, it provides a couple of very, very important aspects. Number one is political leadership. The United States, as a strong supporter, supports the mandate, all the humanitarian values, is in favor of strong international protection. So that's a strong voice. But just as importantly, the United States, being a major superpower, has clout to influence the mandate and all these other items globally in ways, in fact, that the United Nations does not. Oftentimes, and I'll just give you a generic example, oftentimes when there's a problem, say, in a host country, there may be a corruption issue, there may be an international protection issue. Sure, as UNHCR, we can go in and demarche and ask for change and demand change, but oftentimes the government, they have their own political reasons, they may or may not listen. Our next place to go oftentimes is the United States Embassy, where the ambassador, especially in many countries, has a bilateral relationship with that country to say, this is important to the United States as well, and it may affect our relationship in that capacity. Boy, then do we get a bit more of a response to our engagement, and that's very important. So one has to be careful how one uses this, but we really appreciate the political support we receive from the United States. And again, I'm using the U.S. context because this report is about American leadership. This applies to other countries as well. I mean, we can count on Germany and Australia and Canada and many others, including many other countries. I think another political area you see the United States taking a lead and is now playing a very strong lead is on resettlement. And it's leading by example. And I don't want to say to shame others, but particularly in some of America's developed allies, they could be doing more in the resettlement area. And I think the United States is saying, okay, I'm not just talking, I'm walking and I'm doing it. And so you can too. And look, there is a positive impact on the United States. But I don't want to overemphasize resettlement because, as John Thon, as you clearly pointed out, it is only a solution for very few. And it's also expensive. But most importantly, it's for the most vulnerable, and it's not the main durable solution for the vast numbers that are there. I think the second pole of leadership that the United States plays, of course, is in financial leadership. And the United States is UNHCR's number one financial supporter. As an American national and and even as an American taxpayer, I thank that decision because it's humanitarianly very important. But so thank you. But it's not just the direct money that we would receive from the State Department for our operations, but it's also through origin, transit, and host country bilateral national development plans, where USAID plays an important role, particularly, for example, in this hemisphere, in Latin America, of where American bilateral assistance can certainly be put to use on things that are important to UNHCR. We've referenced the World Bank already. I would point out that there are billions of dollars available in the IDA refugee sub-windows and concessional loans. And again, the United States, the number one shareholder at the World Bank, helping take a lead in bringing refugees and bringing displaced into the national conversation and the national development plan. So there is an inclusion. And it's very, very helpful because these people are part of the national economy, the national place, and need to be part of that plan. And in fact, what the World Bank and in partnership with UNHCR and others is doing is ensuring, number one, that inclusion is there, and that's part of the ability to access the money, which now a host government may be quite interested in, but just as importantly, we play a role in helping ensure that the right kind of international protections and asylums are in place so that it's done properly. Another odd aside on this is that it actually, in these kinds of relationships and using the World Bank, IDB, and so on, is it brings the finance and planning ministries and those parts of a government into conversation about refugees, into conversation with UNHCR, where normally they wouldn't be thinking that way. And thinking in various silos and now seeing the importance and why it should be included. So there is this kind of sort of a carrot of inclusion. And the U.S. takes the leadership role in all of these things. They, again, at different levels, but it's very important. And I think you can see it in action, and it reflects globally with us with the UNHCR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sorry that...
I'm sorry, with accountability, 100%, absolutely. Fully be transparent, because that's the only way that you continue to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are under great stewardship.
Excellent. We are out of time, and I do appreciate external relations bearing with us. We're supposed to finish at 2:30. This has happened, of course, when you have speakers that include politicians, but not the panel. Okay. That means I am going to only take one question from the audience, and mostly if there is one online, because we already took two. Only burning question, please, and then I will have the panel exit after that, and then have Jim come with the closing remarks. We will not take that long. Is there an online? Yes. Okay, sorry. In person, please. Thank you. Come with the online one. Okay.
Instead of a global approach to forced migration in the Western Hemisphere, why not address the problem with the Organization of American States? The OAS has the infrastructure in place with fewer members to attain a consensus in comparison to the UN. That's from Marshall B. Lloyd.
That sounds like you, Matt, would answer that question. But then each of you will just take 30 seconds for a final point that you did not put. So, Matt.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to kind of pump this for a reason, because in the coming month or so, IOM, the UNHCR, we are coming out with a hemispheric approach to the refugee and migrant flow regionally, from the very north up to the Arctic, all the way to Antarctica there. And I know that I'm not going to steal the High Commissioner of Refugees' thunder or talking points in advance. So that one is put on hold, come back. I think we'll be working with the Wilson Center on that one, so I'm going to put a plug in for a future time. Also pointing out to a degree that some institutions like OAS have a political wing to them, whereas as a humanitarian agency, we're not involved with the political part of those items. But stay tuned, watch this channel.
Stay tuned. Good question. Okay, Lauren, one last one.
One last. I think I'll make my last plea, and in part because I have UNHCR up here and hopefully some USG colleagues on the line, and just make a bit of a plea. Look, we as Hilton Foundation are really fortunate in our flexibility to fund refugee-led organizations, but as I said, this is not a difficult task, and would really encourage UNHCR and the US government and other donors to really consider the best ways to ramp this up. I know there are existing some mechanisms. In my personal view, they're a bit small. But recognizing also funding is a challenge globally. But I think that there's a way for us to do this in partnership and do it more, better, and more often.
Thank you. That's very brief. Neely.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you again to RAFDI and the Wilson Center for this. I think having sustained methods of engagement is going to take a lot of thought, and that would be sort of my final plea, is to make sure that refugee-led organizations are not just sustained but fully integrated into the rest of civil society work that happens globally, but also specifically here in the U.S. They're not a one-size-fits-all group. There's refugee-led organizations doing everything from advocacy to resettlement services and legal services. And I think it's really critical to uplift these refugee-led organizations specifically for the expertise that they do. And I also just want to emphasize Lauren's point that there is a put your money where your mouth is to the work that we do. It is, and we wouldn't be able to do it without private philanthropy, but it is also really critical for government organizations to provide this funding. There is actually a call coming out by the Office of Refugee Resettlement for lived experience advisory boards that'll be released in May. I think it's a great first step, and we want to encourage that to keep happening. And I will leave it there, actually.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our panel. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I would like to welcome to the podium Dr. Jim Holyfield, who is the Ora Nixon Arnold Professor of International Political Economy and Director of the John Goodwin Tower Center for Political Studies at Southern Methodist University. Jim is the co-chair of RAFDI Working Group and a Wilson Center Global Fellow. It has been great working with him. And Jim, the floor is yours to close.
Okay, I guess I have to provide what the French would call a grande synthèse here. I have to come up with a synthesis. And as the French are wont to do, I want to do it in 3 points, very quickly, to leave you with 3 takeaways. First, I want to say a little bit about the security dimension of this, and then coming back to our colleague from the World Bank, I want to talk about the economic and human development dimension of this. And third, to say a few things about governance issues. But before I do this, I have to thank my colleague Jonathan Majok for the leadership that he has shown with this. And I'm not sure many of you in this room know Susan Martin, who is probably one of the greatest refugee scholars in the world. If you look at this report, you can see her hand in it. We all contributed to it, but Susan is sitting up there in the San Juan Islands in the Puget Sound, hopefully watching this and thinking about us. So when you read the report, think of Susan and the decades of experience that went into drafting this report. Also want to thank the Wilson Center for taking the initiative on this, our colleague Mark Green, who was here earlier, and of course the Hilton Foundation for your generous support. This is the way we move the needle. It's the way we change things and get a dialogue going. Very quickly, when you look at just one little anecdote, when I started working on these issues 40-odd years ago, I was basically an economist transitioning to be a political scientist, and I was told, don't work on this. This is a non-issue. It's a non-topic. Leave it to the sociologists. They are the ones who look at this sort of low politics issues. Well, I think we have learned through bitter experience that this is very much a high politics issue. Certainly during the Cold War, the U.S. provided leadership in building the human rights regime itself. We took a big humanitarian turn with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention itself. So the U.S. has been a leader. We are the country that built this system and put it together. And it's not going to survive. It's not going to do very well unless we continue to lead. And of course, as Susan reminds us in the report, when you look back at the tragedies that happened in the 1920s and 30s, think of the St. Louis, turning back Jewish refugees from Europe because we were not prepared to welcome them here. So I would say on the security front, this is very much a hard power issue. If you look at the crises that are going on around the world, our national security, the stability of the international system depends on the U.S. Continuing to provide leadership in this area. And of course, it's very important for our soft power. As my colleague Joe Nye at Harvard would remind us, we have a tremendous moral obligation to exercise our moral authority. Matthew, you were very eloquent in saying how important it is for the U.S. to continue to provide leadership, both politically but also economically and financially. Secondly, human and economic development. I think we are learning, we should have known already, that migration is probably the biggest development issue on the globe right now. When you think about migration, when you think about development in this hemisphere, and I can't help, I've worked with NOMAD, I've worked with the World Bank on this. They have been leading on this for quite some time. Years ago when I was here as a fellow, Miriam Hazan, who's here from the OAS, I know she's been working at the OAS for some time, but we had a conversation with the Inter-American Development Bank about why they're not looking at migration over there. Migration is such an important issue for the development of this hemisphere. And guess what? The IADB now is working on migration. They have made this a centerpiece of some of their programs. One final point, if you haven't looked at the CBO report on how important migration is for our economic development in this country, our workforce, economic growth is going to depend on migration, and some have pointed out that the number of migrants that we received in the past year or two have helped to keep inflation in check and are contributing tremendously to economic growth. So you're right, migration is a very important issue in human and economic development. So the third point I want to make, and here I put back on my political science hat, is on the governance front. Several people on the panel up here pointed out that we need to create legal pathways, that's the operative term, to allow migrants to come, work, and live here legally. So there's no question that our immigration system, our refugee and asylum policies are broken in this country. I encourage you to look at the report itself, where we talk about what the administration should be doing, what Congress should be doing. I'm not going to go through that, but I want you to have a close look at that. And of course, leading by example. As a longtime scholar of international relations, and again, reflecting what Matthew said earlier, we have an enormous collective action problem here. There is no easy unilateral solution to these issues. There's no silver bullet. It's going to require sustained leadership, thoughtful leadership. Building walls are not going to solve this problem. And on this score, and if you read my policy brief for this project, we have to really work hard to support the institutions that we have, especially the UNHCR. We've got to support the Refugee Convention. It's the only convention that we've got. I don't think, going back to Cindy Aronson's comments, now's not the time to open up the convention, politically speaking. So there's going to continue to be war. There's going to continue to be conflict. We will have natural disasters. Climate change is one of the proximate drivers of migration. So we're going to have a global approach. That requires leadership to solve the collective action problems that are out there, to underwrite the solutions. We're going to have strong neighborhoods. The Europeans are doing what they're doing. We're doing what we're doing in this hemisphere. This is a big issue in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East. It is truly a global issue. I would just conclude by saying that, going back to some of the anecdotes that you've already heard, just how important civil society is in this, right down to the grassroots level. I'm always amazed at what the Roman Catholic Church does in this area, looking at Caritas or Catholic Charities. Think of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, how important it has been. And finally, look at my colleague John Thon, the leadership that the refugees themselves are providing. They represent an enormous pool of human capital waiting to be tapped. So we've got to think not just about all of the governance and structural issues, but we also have to think about the agency that's involved here and the people. So I think on that note, I will leave you with those three thoughts. And we've got to go out and really work hard to confront this issue. It is the issue, I think, of the 21st century. Thank you.